My mother called me the morning my father was buried to tell me she'd found something in his desk, and I remember thinking that was strange, because my father didn't have a desk. He had a workbench in the garage covered in engine grease and old receipts, and a kitchen table where he paid bills in cash, and that was it. So when she said his desk, I knew immediately she meant the one in the cabin, the one none of us had ever been allowed inside. My father's name was Roy Decker. He worked 31 years as a structural inspector for Klamath County, drove the same '98 Ford F-150 until the transmission gave out twice, and never once in my memory took a vacation that wasn't a camping trip within driving distance of our house in Medford, Oregon. He was not a man of secrets, or so He died of a heart attack at 67, alone in the driveway one Tuesday morning in February, and the funeral was small because he'd wanted it that way. I'm a nurse practitioner. I work pediatric urgent care in Portland, and I'd driven down for the service with my husband. My younger brother flew in from Phoenix. My mother stood dry-eyed through the whole thing, the way she stands through everything. Like she's already sorted out her feelings somewhere private and isn't going to perform them for anyone. I've always admired that about her and found it a little frightening. After the graveside service, she pulled me aside while my brother was talking to my aunt. She kept her voice low even though no one was close enough to hear. She told me that 3 days before my father died, he'd mailed her a key and a letter. He'd mailed it, she said, like he knew. The letter told her that if anything happened to him, she needed to go to the cabin on Fuller Creek before she made any decisions about anything. And she was not to bring my father's brother Dale. Dale had shown up to the funeral with his wife Connie, both of them freshly tanned from what looked like a cruise, and they'd hugged my mother for slightly too long and said things like, "We're going to get through this together," in the particular tone people use when they've already decided what getting through something should look like. I asked my mother if she'd gone to the cabin yet. She said no. She'd waited for me. I want to stop here and explain something about the cabin on Fuller Creek, because people who grew up in places like Klamath County understand this instinctively, but maybe not everyone does. A cabin out there isn't a vacation home. It's a piece of land with a structure on it, sometimes insulated, sometimes not, sometimes with running water, often without reliable heat. My father had owned the Fuller Creek property since before I was born. He took me there once when I was maybe 8 to show me the creek, and after that he went alone. He never made a rule about it exactly. It was more like the understanding you develop around a parent's private thing. The way you don't read someone's journal not because they told you not to, but because you can see it's theirs. So it wasn't forbidden, it was just his. My mother and I drove out there the morning after the funeral. My brother wanted to come. I told him we'd call him after. He didn't like that, but he went back to the house, and I could see in his face that he was going to call Dale before we even got to the end of the road. That's the thing about my brother. He's not a bad person, but he talks before he thinks, and Dale had always been better at getting information out of him than any of us realized. The cabin was 40 minutes from town on a county road that turned to gravel for the last 8 miles. My mother held the key in her lap the whole drive and didn't say anything. I didn't either. We'd always been able to do that, the two of us, sit in silence without it meaning something was wrong. The property was small, maybe 3 acres, most of it Douglas fir and scrub. The cabin itself was newer than I expected. New metal roof, fresh wood on the porch, a propane tank on the side that looked recently replaced. My father had been coming out here and maintaining this place quietly for years. The key opened a padlock on the front door. Inside smelled like sawdust and cold air, and something faintly chemical like sealant. 2 rooms. The front one was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a metal shelf with canned goods. The back room was why we'd come. My father had built shelves along every wall. On them were binders, accordion folders, labeled plastic bins. On the table in the center sat a laptop in a waterproof case, and on top of that, an envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting. My mother saw it and stepped back. She said, "That one's for you. I have mine." She pulled a folded letter from her coat pocket. She'd had it since the key arrived and hadn't shown it to me. I understood. I opened mine. My father wrote the way he talked, short sentences, no extra words. He said he was sorry for the confusion. He said everything in the back room was mine to go through, and that I'd understand once I did. He said the laptop password was the name of the dog we'd had when I was 12, a shepherd mix named Butterscotch. Followed by the year the county hired him. He said not to let Dale see any of it before I'd read it myself. And then he wrote, I know you're the one who'll handle this right. I always knew that. I'm sorry I didn't just say so while I was standing in front of you. I sat down at the table. My mother read her own letter in the other room. I heard nothing from her for a long time. The laptop opened to a folder labeled with my name. Inside were subfolders: property, financials, Dale legal. I opened property first. Deeds, survey maps, permit applications. The Fuller Creek parcel was one of four. Four properties my father had acquired over the span of 20 years, each one bought quietly, taxes paid on time, no mortgages. The total assessed value across all four was just over $1.2 million. One of the parcels, a 12-acre plot outside Ashland, had been under a conservation easement negotiation with the Oregon Department of Forestry for the past 2 years, with projected annual payments in the range of $40,000 if approved. I opened the Dale folder. It took me a long time to get through it. When I came out to the front room, my mother was sitting in one of the chairs with her hands flat on her knees, looking at the wood stove. I told her what I'd found. She nodded slowly, like she'd suspected some version of it. She said, "He always worried about Dale." What I'd found was this: Dale had known about the properties, not all of them, not the details, but he'd known my father had been acquiring land, and about 4 years ago he'd started pressuring him to formalize a partnership. My father had refused. Dale had then started telling people, neighbors, people at their church, my father's old colleagues, that the two brothers had a verbal agreement, that the land was a shared venture, that my father was confused about the paperwork. He'd found a notary in Grants Pass who'd helped him draw up a document claiming a 50% interest in the Fuller Creek property specifically. The document was not signed by my father. The notary's stamp, when I looked it up later, belonged to a license that had been suspended 2 years earlier. My father had found out about the document 8 months before he died. He'd spent those 8 months quietly building a file. I drove back to town and called my husband first. He's a contractor, practical and calm in the way that used to frustrate me early in our marriage, and now I'm just grateful for. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Okay, what do you need right now?" I told him I needed him to drive down tomorrow and bring our file box, the one with our own property documents, because I needed somewhere to think clearly that wasn't my mother's house. Then I called the family attorney, a woman named Frances Adler who'd handled my parents' wills and had an office above a tax preparation place on Main Street. I'd met her once at a Christmas party years ago. I asked if I could come in the next morning. She said yes. When I got back to my mother's house, Dale's car was in the driveway. He was in the kitchen with my brother and Connie, and there was coffee, and the whole thing had the texture of something that had been arranged. Dale looked up when I came in, and he smiled in the way that people smile when they've been waiting for you and have already rehearsed what they're going to say. He said it was so good to see me, given the circumstances. He said he'd been thinking, and that given what my father had built over the years, it might be smart to sit down together as a family and figure out next steps before anything got complicated. My mother was standing at the counter. She hadn't sat down with them. That told me everything. I said, "That's a good idea. I have an appointment with Frances Adler tomorrow. You're welcome to bring your own attorney if you want." The smile didn't change, but something behind it did. Connie touched Dale's arm. My brother looked at his coffee. That night, after everyone had left, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I was going to do what Dad said, read it all, understand it all, and then make decisions. She nodded and said, "He picked right." I didn't sleep much. I lay in my old bedroom with the street noise coming in through a window that had never quite sealed, and I thought about my father going out to that cabin by himself, year after year, building something without explaining it. I don't know if I was angry at him. I think what I felt was closer to grief for all the conversations we hadn't had. He'd trusted me to handle something he couldn't bring himself to talk about out loud, and that was a form of love I understood, but it was also the kind that leaves you alone with the weight of it. Frances Adler was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 40s, with the kind of directness I immediately appreciated. I laid out everything on her desk: the printed deeds, the Dale folder, the document with the suspicious notary stamp. She went through it methodically. When she finished, she said the forged document was a serious problem for Dale, not for us. She said Oregon law was clear that a deed transfer required the owner's signature, not a claimed verbal agreement. She said she'd file an affidavit with the county that same week establishing my mother as sole heir and flagging the fraudulent document with the state bar. She also said gently that Dale had apparently contacted the Oregon Department of Forestry, posing as a family representative, to inquire about the conservation easement timeline. If he'd misrepresented himself, that was potentially a different legal matter entirely. I asked her how fast we needed to move. She said fast. My husband arrived that afternoon. He drove 4 hours without stopping and walked in with a file box and 2 coffees and looked at my face and said, "How bad?" I said, "We'll handle it." He nodded and put the coffees down and didn't say anything else about it until I was ready to talk. That evening, my brother came over without Dale. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug, and he looked younger than his age, the way he sometimes does, the way that reminds me we're still the same 2 kids who grew up in this house. He said, "I talked to Uncle Dale. He made it sound like Dad had promised him something." I said I knew. I showed him the file. Not everything, but enough. I watched his face go through surprise and then embarrassment and then something harder. He said, "He called me last night and asked me to find out what was in the cabin." I said, "I know you didn't tell him anything." He said, "I didn't know what was in it." He paused. "I should have asked you before I picked up." That was enough for me. Over the next 3 days, Frances moved fast. She filed the affidavit. She sent a letter to Dale's attorney, a man named something I never bothered to remember, outlining the evidence of document fraud and requesting that all communication about the estate go through her office. She contacted the Department of Forestry and clarified that any inquiries made by Dale Decker did not represent the family's position and that the easement negotiation should proceed directly through my mother's legal representation. Dale responded by calling my mother directly. I know this because my mother told me, calmly and without drama, that he'd called 3 times in one day and that the 3rd time he'd said, "Lillian, you know Roy wanted us to be taken care of. You know he'd want this handled, family." My mother had said, "He handled it. I'm following his instructions. Please contact Frances." And then she'd hung up. I want to say something about my mother here. She is 64 years old. She worked front desk at an orthodontist's office for 22 years and raised 2 kids and kept a household running on a county inspector's salary, and she has never once in my memory complained about any of it. She is not a dramatic person, but she is not a soft one either. Watching her hang up on Dale and go back to the crossword she'd been doing was one of the quieter, satisfying things I've ever witnessed. On the 4th day, a blog post appeared online. It was from a local community Facebook group that sometimes posted articles, and the headline was something like, "Family Dispute May Stall Conservation Project Benefiting Klamath Ranchers." It quoted an unnamed family member saying that the estate was being controlled by an out-of-town daughter who didn't understand the land or the community and was blocking a project my father had promised to support. There was a photo of the Ashland parcel that I couldn't figure out how Dale had gotten. My brother texted me a screenshot with a question mark. I didn't answer right away. I called Frances instead. She said, "Don't respond publicly. Let me draft a factual statement to send to the forestry contact and the county commissioner's office. Paper trail first, narrative second." I said that was fine. I asked her if she'd ever seen anything like this before. She said, "More than you'd think. When people are desperate about money, they get creative." My husband read the article and said he's scared. I said, "I know." "Scared people don't stop," he said. "They escalate." I wrote that down. The escalation came the next morning in the form of an email from an attorney I didn't recognize, addressed to me, my brother, and my mother simultaneously. It claimed to represent Dale Decker's interest in the Fuller Creek property under an oral contract theory, and it demanded a meeting within 72 hours to discuss a negotiated resolution before the matter required court intervention. The language was aggressive but thin. Frances read it and said, "They've got nothing. This is pressure." She drafted a response declining the meeting and citing our pending court filings. She sent it within the hour. I drove out to the cabin that afternoon by myself. I needed to be somewhere that didn't have Dale's energy in it. I brought the laptop and the binders and sat at the table in the back room and went through everything again more carefully. My father's records were meticulous in the way that surprised me and also didn't. He'd always balanced his checkbook by hand. He'd always kept receipts. He'd extended that same precision here. Dates, amounts, the name of the real estate agent he'd worked with, copies of every tax payment, records of every conversation with the Department of Forestry annotated in pencil in the margins. There was one file I'd missed the first time. It was in the back of the legal folder, a smaller envelope inside the accordion folder, sealed with a strip of tape and labeled if needed. Inside was a handwritten note and a USB drive. The note said, "On the drive, recordings. Dale called twice asking about the easement. I let him talk. RD. I drove back to town and plugged the drive into my husband's laptop. There were 2 audio files, each about 15 minutes long. My father's voice was steady, the way it always was. Dale talked for most of both recordings. He talked about what he was owed, about the verbal agreement, about how he'd helped my father identify the Ashland parcel originally, which contradicted the timeline in every document my father had kept. He talked about investors he'd found who were interested in the easement payments. He mentioned a specific dollar figure he'd already promised someone in exchange for a finder's fee. My brother was in the kitchen when I came back in. I handed him the laptop with the audio queued up and watched him listen. He didn't move for the whole 15 minutes. When it was done, he set the laptop on the table and said he knew about this. It wasn't a question. I said yes. He said Dad recorded him. I said yes. He looked at the wall for a long moment. He really didn't think Dale would stop on his own, he said. No, I said, he didn't. My brother sat quietly. Then he said, "What do we do with it?" I said, "Give it to Francis. Let the law deal with it." He nodded. Okay. He picked up his coffee. "I'm sorry I called Dale." I said he didn't know what he didn't know. He said, "I'm going to stop picking up when he calls." I said that was probably for the best. Francis got the recordings the next morning. She was quiet for a long time after I sent them. When she called back, she said the recordings were significant, that Oregon was a one-party consent state, that my father had been a party to both calls, and that the mention of the investor arrangement and the promised finder's fee created potential exposure for Dale on several fronts, including wire fraud. She said she was going to contact the county DA's office. Dale called my mother once more after that on a Sunday. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail that started calm and ended less so. She played it for me once without comment and then saved it to a folder on her phone she'd labeled, in her practical way, Dale Legal. I don't know where she learned to do that. Maybe some things just come naturally. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks after the funeral, at Francis's office. My mother wore the grey blazer she wears to important things. I wore the same clothes I'd have worn to a difficult meeting at work. Neat but not formal, because I didn't want to look like I was performing seriousness. I just was serious. Dale arrived with his attorney and Connie, who sat in a chair by the window and didn't look at anyone. Dale had aged since the funeral in the way that stress can do in a short time. Or maybe I was just seeing him differently. He kept his hands flat on the table. He looked at my mother first, and I could see him trying to find the version of her that might be moved by sentiment and not finding it. The mediator, a retired circuit court judge named something with a lot of consonants that I immediately forgot, laid out the ground rules and asked each side to summarize its position. Dale's attorney said they weren't disputing the will itself, just certain understandings my father had conveyed verbally over the years regarding shared stewardship of the family land. He used the word stewardship 3 times. He said Dale had contributed time and knowledge to helping my father identify properties and that this informal partnership was understood by both parties. Francis laid out our position without drama. She presented the deeds. She presented the fraudulent document and the notary's suspended license. She presented the Department of Forestry correspondence showing Dale's unauthorized contact. She played 11 minutes of one of the audio recordings. The room was very quiet during the recording. When it ended, Dale's attorney asked for a 5-minute break. The mediator said, of course. Dale didn't look at me or my mother. He looked at the table. When they came back, the attorney said his client was prepared to withdraw all claims and sign a statement acknowledging the estate's sole ownership, in exchange for the family agreeing not to pursue civil damages. He said this was offered in a spirit of family reconciliation. Francis looked at me. I looked at my mother. My mother said, in the same tone she uses to tell a telemarketer she's not interested, "That's acceptable, provided the statement is specific about the document and the forestry contact." The attorney said they could agree to that. It took another 40 minutes to finalize the language. Dale signed without speaking. He didn't look up when he was done. Connie gathered her bag and they left before the copies were finished printing. My mother and I walked to my car in the parking lot and she said, "I need lunch." We went to a diner 2 blocks away and ordered soup and sandwiches and sat across from each other at a window booth. The sun was coming through the glass in the way it does in March in southern Oregon, low and sideways, making everything look a little more exposed than you expect. My mother ate her soup, I ate my sandwich. After a while, she said he would have done this himself if he'd had more time. I said I know. She said he trusted you to do it the way he would have. I didn't answer right away. I watched a truck pull out of the parking lot across the street. Then I said, I think I'm starting to understand what that meant to him. She said, good. The easement negotiation with the Department of Forestry was finalized 2 months later. The annual payments go to my mother. The Ashland parcel will remain undeveloped for 50 years, Douglas firs and high desert grass, and whatever animals make a life in the places people leave alone. My father had negotiated a community access clause into the preliminary agreement. 2 marked trails open to the public for hiking, no motorized vehicles. Frances said it was unusual for a private landowner to include that kind of provision. I told her it sounded exactly like him. My brother flew back to Phoenix a week after the mediation. Before he left, he came by the cabin with me one more time. We didn't go through anything. We just stood in the front room for a while, looking at the wood stove and the 2 chairs. My brother said, I didn't know he was like this. I said, like what? He thought about it. Quiet about the things that mattered. I said, yeah. He said, I think I'm more like Dale than I want to be. That took something from him to say, and I didn't make it bigger than it needed to be. I just said, you're also the person who came to find me instead of staying in that kitchen with him. He was quiet. Then he said, that counts for something. I said it did. My husband and I drove back to Portland on a Sunday. I had a shift Monday morning, a full waiting room, a kid with croup, and 2 possible ear infections, and a teenager who'd been putting off telling her parents about a rash for 3 weeks. The ordinary work of keeping people intact. I've been doing this long enough that I can hold 2 things at once, the strangeness of my own life and the immediate present need of whoever's in front of me. The Fuller Creek cabin is mine now, along with my mother's share. We haven't decided what to do with it yet. My mother has been out there twice since the funeral. She replaced the chairs. She says she likes the quiet. I've started going on Sunday mornings when my husband is at his soccer league. I bring coffee and the laptop sometimes, but mostly I just sit in the front room with the door open and listen to the creek. My father's records are still in the back room on the shelves he built. I've scanned everything and stored it on an encrypted drive, the way Frances suggested. But I've left the originals where they are. Binders, accordion folders, the penciled notes in the margins of the forestry correspondence. I leave them there because they're his handwriting, and because the cabin is the place where he said the things he couldn't say out loud, and I'm not ready to move any of that yet. Some mornings, sitting there with the door open and the firs outside, and the sound of the water, I think about the letter he wrote, the last line especially, I know you're the one who'll handle this right. He'd carried that thought for years apparently, and never once said it to my face. I spent a long time being a little angry about that. I'm not anymore. Some people say the things they mean in letters and in careful records and in property quietly held and maintained, and the love is real even if the words never quite made it into a conversation. I know that now. I'm living it. And on the mornings when the light comes through the trees and hits the water just right, it feels less like a loss and more like something that was always mine, waiting for me to come find it.